Welcome back. I'm going to leave this graph up for you to look at, and as I have emphasized many times, I will give you a sheet with formulas and everything, but I will not, I have not set up this video online program to give you a lot of notes. You have books to go back to and so on. I want this video to be the essential piece. So I'm coming back to this graph. What does this graph tell us? For those inclined to be visual, it tells us the following. The return on assets and the weighted average cost of capital is the only thing that will not change with financing. What will, however, change is as you take on debt, there will be a break between the return on asset and return on equity. And in life, very few things are true. What's true is return on equity will be always greater than or equal to return on asset, because the beta of equity is always greater than the beta of assets or equal to, and therefore what will change is the return on equity will start going up. The return on debt is always below return on equity because it's less risk. But the weighted average of the two. Why weighted average? Because you have to weight returns by the amount of equity and debt in the capital structure will remain the same. This result, i.e., the straight line that's cutting right through the heart will not be affected by financing is, I think, such a profound result. Again, because it's simple. And again, because it's mostly true. In fact, there's a lot of research written we'll go to into why the real world looks a little bit different from this, but we'll get to that in a second. But even in spite of man-made intrusions, this result is profoundly true for the most part. It makes a lot of sense. So let me give one more shot before doing an example. And that example, by the way, will be really slow, really capturing all elements of what we have done. And then I encourage you to do the assignments as and when you find the time. They're increasing in complexity. And this is the last assignment of the whole program, because next week we'll focus largely on the big issues and give you time to recap and study for the final. Okay? So let's get started here. So what's going on? Where is value being created? Big question. Assets or liabilities? Simple. Value is created by your assets. You can also think of this as your ideas. And by the way, you can think of any asset. Small garage based entrepreneur to the biggest company in the world, to a person buying a house, and so on and so forth. Okay, so real assets have two things: cash flow and return on asset. Right? So let's start with this. What determines the return on assets on your real ideas? The marketplace. And what is the risk associated with it? Given that people who invest in your real assets don't invest in just you being Orange, they also invest in what? Many other things. The kind of risk that is called beta asset. Unfortunately, both are not observable, because the real assets, the products and services produced by your buildings and ideas and so on, are clearly observable, right? But the return requires trading in the value to determine the value of your assets. Not done. So now we have to go to the right-hand side. This is where finance starts adding quote-unquote value. Financing? No. Finance, yes. Okay. So this we call return on equity. Corresponding risk we call beta equity. This return is called return on debt. Lowercase, uppercase, I go back and forth, I apologize. And its risk is also beta debt. Which is easier to measure? Which is more complicated, equity or debt? Obviously equity. Debt is promise payment, equity is love and fresh air, tough. But because equity trades, it's easier to figure out the beta of equity. That's why almost all published betas are equity betas. So now here's what the problem is. You know that RA and beta A is the thing you want to know. How do you figure out beta A and RA? You're left to going to the other side of the balance sheet. Let us assume, like Apple, there's no debt. What's true? Life is very simple. You just take the beta equity of Apple, plug into which, I shouldn't say plug, but that's what you do. The two are related through CAPM. Beta equity, return on equity through CAPM. In our exercise, we'll do it. CAPM is so simple that I worry people plug and chug with it. It's just a model. You know, everything. It's just so simple. That's what its beauty is. Beta debt to return on debt is a little bit more complicated because debt doesn't trade that much, and as in many countries, it's a relationship between a bank and a company. So we'll get to that in a second. The good news is if there's no debt, beta equity and beta asset are the same. Return on equity, return on assets are the same, and we are off and running. However, if there's debt, what happens? The key thing to remember is this. The total risk of your idea is beta asset. You cannot change that by financing. It's like saying, I can change the nature of an iPad simply by using debt or equity. Doesn't make sense. iPad depends on its technical architecture, blah, blah, blah. And nothing to do with financing, right? So beta asset is kind of given by the marketplace. How you divide it up between your financing components is up to your decision, you being the manager or owner. So if you have no debt, beta asset and beta equity are the same. If you have debt, what is beta asset equal to? A weighted average of beta equity and beta debt. Similarly, what is return on assets equal to? Weighted average of return on equity, return on debt. That's why it's called weighted average cost of capital. In fact, I think the word cost of capital is unfortunate because you start thinking that somehow capital is the source of returns and value. No, your idea is. But because you cannot measure the return on your idea directly, you go to measure it through your liability. So this is one more view of the same. And I'll just wrap this up a little bit and then go on to the example. And I'll do the example exceptionally slowly. And I will almost force you, long distance, by WACC, mind molding, to make you stop and think at each question. Promise you that. Okay, so let's do it one more time. To evaluate any idea or a project, you want the beta and return on the assets. That's the only thing you want. Since the beta of assets is not observable, you can run with beta equity only if you have no debt. Otherwise, please focus on what this says. You have to purge the effects of debt from equity to make it equal to beta of assets. Remember, one more time, if there's no debt, no problem. Risk of equity is the risk of business. But as you take on more debt, one of them goes up. Which one? Beta equity, because you can't change beta assets based on the marketplace. Now, if you want beta asset of a firm that has both equity and debt, you got a problem. You got to take beta equity, which you can observe or estimate, and remove the effects of financing, because you know financing is not going to add value or destroy value.